October 2nd, 1552, 4:47 in the afternoon. On a hill overlooking the Volga River, a city is burning. From this distance, 3 miles east across the water, the flames look almost beautiful, orange and gold against the darkening sky, smoke rising in thick columns, twisting in the wind like dark spirits ascending. If you didn't know better, you might think it was a festival, bonfires celebrating some ancient harvest ritual. But if you listen carefully, past the crackle of timber and the roar of the inferno, you can hear something else. Screaming, the clash of steel on steel, the thunder of buildings collapsing inward as their foundations give way. The desperate prayers of the dying. Kazan is dying. Inside those walls, 10,000 Tatar cavalry are fighting to their last breath. These are men who have never known defeat on the open steppe, warriors whose grandfathers rode with the Khans who conquered half the world. Now they are trapped in narrow streets where their horses cannot maneuver, where their legendary mobility means nothing. They are being cut down block by block, house by house, prayer by prayer. Outside those walls, 150,000 Russian troops pour through 3 massive breaches in the fortifications. Gaps so wide you could drive a wagon train through them. These breaches were not made by battering rams. They were not made by siege towers or scaling ladders or any conventional weapon of medieval warfare. They were made by explosions. Explosions that shook the earth for miles around. Explosions that came from below, from the darkness beneath the city, from places the defenders never thought to guard. And watching it all unfold from his command tent on that distant hill is a young man. 22 years old. His hands are clasped in prayer. His eyes are fixed on the burning city. He has not moved from this spot for 6 hours. His commanders have brought him reports of the fighting, updates on casualties, requests for orders. He has responded to each mechanically, his gaze never leaving that distant inferno. His name is Ivan Vasilyevich. History will remember him as Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. But here is what history often forgets to mention. This burning city represents the end of something that lasted 300 years. 3 centuries of subjugation. 3 centuries of Russian princes paying tribute to masters who ruled from horseback. 3 centuries of kneeling before Khans who could destroy entire principalities with a word. And the question is not how this city fell. In the end, superior engineering and overwhelming force would always prevail against even the strongest walls. The question is why it took 300 years to even try. Why this city, sitting barely 800 kilometers from Moscow, had repelled 10 previous Russian attempts to conquer it. Why men who commanded armies of 100,000 soldiers had turned back from these walls in defeat again and again for nearly a century. The question is what changed? What made the 11th attempt different from the 10 that failed? The answer lies not in the flames before us, but in the years that came before. In understanding not just how Kazan fell, but why it had to fall, and why the man watching it burn had become someone willing to pay any price to see it happen. To understand what is happening on this October afternoon in 1552, you have to go back, way back, to a time when the world was a different place. When the greatest empire in human history stretched from Korea to Hungary, from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, the Mongol Empire. In the winter of 1237, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived on the borders of Russian territory with an army that moved like a force of nature. The Russian princes had heard rumors of what was coming. Travelers from the east brought tales of cities reduced to ash, of armies that could cover 70 miles in a single day, of warriors who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. The princes did not believe the rumors. How could they? Their world operated on different rules. European warfare meant heavy cavalry, armored knights, slow-moving formations. Battles were formal affairs, often negotiated in advance. Cities could withstand sieges for months or years. The Mongols changed everything in a matter of weeks. They swept through the Russian principalities like a scythe through wheat. They had multiple horses per rider, rotating mounts to maintain a brutal pace that left defending armies exhausted and confused. They had composite bows that could punch through armor at ranges European weapons couldn't match. They had a communication system called the YAM, a network of relay stations that could transmit messages 500 miles in 24 hours. Think about that for a moment. In an age when most European armies struggled to coordinate movements across 50 miles, when a message from a king to his general might take a week to arrive, the Mongols had essentially invented military logistics as we know it. They could concentrate forces where they were needed, respond to threats before defenders even knew they were coming, and operate as a unified command structure across distances that seemed impossible. The great city of Ryazan fell in 5 days. Moscow burned. Vladimir, Suzdal, Kozelsk, one after another, the principalities collapsed. And then came Kiev. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, the heart of Slavic civilization. The city of golden domes and libraries filled with manuscripts going back centuries, the spiritual center of Orthodox Christianity in the East. When the Mongols demanded its surrender in 1240, the city's defenders chose to fight. It was a slaughter. The Mongols brought siege engines, catapults that hurled stones and flaming projectiles. They brought thousands of skilled engineers who understood how to reduce fortifications. And when the walls fell, they showed no mercy. Kiev was leveled, burned to ash. When travelers passed through its ruins decades later, they wrote that you could still smell death in the soil, that the ground was white with bones. And then came something worse than conquest: the system. You see, the Mongols were not interested in occupying Russia. They didn't have the manpower to garrison every city, didn't want to waste resources administering territories that far from their heartland. Instead, they created something far more effective, far more psychologically devastating. The Golden Horde, as it came to be known, ruled Russia through what we might call remote control. Every year, Russian princes had to travel to Sarai, the Mongol capital 600 miles south on the lower Volga. They had to kneel before the Khan. They had to present tribute, anywhere from 10 to 30% of their annual revenue. And most importantly, they had to receive a yarlik, a patent of authority, that gave them permission to rule their own lands. Think about that word. Permission. You are a Russian prince. Your family has ruled these lands for generations. Your grandfather was a prince, your great-grandfather before him, going back to the dawn of your dynasty. But now you rule only because a Mongol Khan sitting in a tent city hundreds of miles away says you can rule. And if he changes his mind tomorrow, everything you have can be taken away, not by invasion, by decree. But the genius of the system went deeper. The Mongols understood something fundamental about human nature. They understood that the best way to control a population is not to oppress them directly. It is to make them oppress each other. Russian princes competed for those yarlik patents. They bid against each other, offering higher tribute to gain favor. They informed on each other, reporting any hint of disloyalty to win the Khan's trust. And when the Khan wanted to punish a disobedient prince, he didn't send Mongol armies. He gave the yarlik to that prince's rival and let the Russians destroy each other. This was not military occupation. This was collaborative subjugation. The Mongols had turned the Russian princes into enforcers of their own servitude. They had created a system where resisting the Khans meant not just fighting Mongols, but fighting your own neighbors who had been promised your lands if you failed. For 240 years, this system worked with devastating efficiency. Russian princes paid their tribute. They settled their disputes in Sarai rather than on the battlefield because the Khan's word was final. They learned to speak Mongol, adopted Mongol customs, married into Mongol families when permitted. The psychological impact was total. An entire civilization learned to see itself as subordinate, as existing only at the sufferance of masters who could annihilate them if they stepped out of line. But systems, no matter how well designed, eventually decay. By the mid-15th century, the Golden Horde was fragmenting. Succession disputes tore at its foundations. Power struggles between rival khans weakened central authority. The vast distances that had once been an advantage, allowing control without occupation, now became a liability as regional strongmen carved out their own territories. In 1480, there was a famous confrontation on the Ugra River. A Mongol army and a Russian army, led by Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow, faced each other across the water for weeks. Both sides maneuvered, probed, but neither attacked. And then, in what historians call the Great Stand, the Mongols simply turned around and rode south. The age of direct Mongol domination was over. Russia was technically free. Technically. Because 3 successor states remained, carved from the corpse of the Golden Horde. 3 khanates that preserved Mongol military culture, Tatar cavalry traditions, and the institutional memory of when they had been the masters and Russians had been the subjects. Crimea to the southwest, controlling the Black Sea trade routes. Astrakhan at the mouth of the Volga, commanding the gateway to the Caspian Sea and Persia beyond. And Kazan. Of these 3, Kazan was the most dangerous, not because it was the largest or the richest, but because of location and what that location represented. Kazan sat on the Middle Volga, roughly 800 kilometers east of Moscow. The city was built on a high hill overlooking the river, a natural fortress position that gave defenders commanding views of any approaching army. From this position, the Tatars of Kazan controlled everything moving between Moscow and the east. Furs from Siberia, grain from the steppes, slaves captured in raids on Russian villages. All of it flowed through Kazan, and the Tatars took their cut. But more than economics, Kazan represented something psychological. The city had been founded in 1438, built deliberately as a statement of Mongol successor power on Russian borders. Its walls were massive, oak logs backed with compacted earth, designed to withstand both artillery fire and direct assault. Its garrison consisted of elite Tatar cavalry, men trained from childhood in the traditional steppe warfare that had conquered empires, and for over a century those walls had never been breached. Between 1469 and 1550, Russian forces attempted to conquer Kazan at least 10 times, 10 separate campaigns. 10 times armies marched east, with banners flying and ambitions high. 10 times they retreated in failure. The pattern was always the same. Russian forces would arrive at the end of lengthy supply lines, having marched across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. They would establish siege works, begin bombardment with whatever artillery they could transport that far from their bases. But they were operating at the extreme limit of their logistics. Food ran low, ammunition was exhausted faster than it could be replaced. Disease spread through camps that couldn't move to fresh water sources. And then Tatar cavalry would hit those vulnerable supply lines. Fast raids that materialized out of nowhere, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before Russian forces could respond. Wagon trains burned, supply depots destroyed. The thin thread connecting the besieging army to distant Moscow would be cut, and the entire campaign would unravel. By 1550, Kazan had become more than a city. It had become a symbol. Proof that even in their diminished state, even reduced to a regional khanate rather than a world-spanning empire, the heirs of the Mongols were still beyond Russian capability to defeat. And then a boy who had endured hell decided that was unacceptable. Ivan Vasilievich was born in August 1530 to Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow, and his second wife, Elena Glinskaya. He was their first son, the heir to the throne, the future of the dynasty. His father was 49 years old when Ivan was born, already an old man by medieval standards, and there was great celebration that the succession was secure. Ivan was 3 years old when his father died, 3 years old when his world collapsed, and everything that followed became possible. What happened next shaped everything Ivan would become. His father's death created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the boyars, the great noble families of Moscow, who were supposed to protect the child prince and govern in his name until he came of age. Instead, they tore the state apart, fighting each other for power and privilege. Young Ivan watched his mother die when he was 8, possibly poisoned by rival factions, though this was never proven. Chronicles describe him as eerily silent at her funeral, a small boy who did not cry, who did not rage, who simply stood and watched as the only person who had protected him was lowered into the ground. He did not protest when boyars burst into his chambers at night to arrest rivals who had sought his protection, dragging men away to imprisonment or execution while the child prince looked on. He watched the boyars live in luxury, wearing furs and hosting feasts, while he and his younger brother Yuri were sometimes left to go hungry, treated as inconveniences rather than sovereigns. He watched them murder each other in palace corridors, blood on marble floors, bodies disposed of quietly while the business of plunder continued. He learned that power was the only thing that mattered, that weakness invited destruction, that mercy was a luxury only the strong could afford. There are accounts from this period that paint a disturbing picture. Young Ivan apparently took out his rage on animals, torturing them in ways that shocked even the hardened boyars. Whether this is true or propaganda written later to explain his adult cruelty, we cannot know. But we know that he was developing a personality shaped by trauma, by watching those who should have protected him instead use him as a pawn. By the time Ivan was 16, he had endured 13 years of this chaos. 13 years of boyar factions using a child as their figurehead while they enriched themselves and weakened the state. 13 years of humiliation and fear and carefully hidden rage. In January 1547, Ivan did something unprecedented. He declared himself not Grand Prince, the traditional title, but Tsar. From Caesar, Emperor. It was a claim to authority that transcended the boyar system, a statement that his power came not from noble approval, but from God himself. He was crowning himself as the heir not just to the princes of Moscow, but to the emperors of Rome and Byzantium. The boyars, divided among themselves and weakened by years of internal conflict, could not effectively resist, and Ivan immediately began implementing changes that would transform Russian military capability. He created the Streltsy, Russia's first professional standing army. Prior to this, Russian military forces were feudal levies. Each boyar was obligated to bring his own men when called to war. They arrived when convenient, left when they wanted to go home, owed loyalty to their lord rather than the state. This made coordinated operations nearly impossible and gave individual boyars dangerous military power. The Streltsy were different. They were soldiers paid by the state, equipped by the state, trained by the state. Most importantly, they owed loyalty to the Tsar alone. These were Russia's first musketeers, armed with arquebuses imported from Europe or manufactured in Moscow's new armories, trained in disciplined volley fire that could break cavalry charges and hold defensive positions. This was revolutionary. Ivan was creating a military instrument that responded to his command, not to the whims of fractious nobles who might or might not support his policies. And he had one target in mind for this new instrument: Kazan. In 1547, barely a year after declaring himself Tsar, 17-year-old Ivan launched his first campaign against the city. He brought a large army, heavy artillery dragged hundreds of miles over terrible roads, and complete confidence that his new reforms and personal determination would succeed where others had failed. Winter rains destroyed his plans before he even reached Kazan. The primitive roads turned to impassable mud. Artillery pieces sank to their axles and couldn't be moved. Supplies never arrived because the wagons couldn't get through. The army bogged down 100 miles from its target and had to turn back without ever seeing the walls they intended to breach. It was a humiliating failure. Worse than the military defeat was the political damage. The boyars who had opposed Ivan's reforms pointed to the disaster as proof that the young Tsar was incompetent, that his new methods were untested and unreliable. Ivan learned from failure. In 1549 he tried again. This time he waited for better weather, planned his logistics more carefully. The army reached Kazan, and his artillery pounded the walls for weeks. But Tatar cavalry hit his supply lines repeatedly. Food ran out. Disease spread through the camp as men drank contaminated water and lived in increasingly squalid conditions. After months of siege with no breakthrough, Ivan had to order another retreat. In 1550, a third attempt. Same careful planning, same logistical preparation, same result. The fundamental equation had not changed. Kazan was simply too far from Moscow to sustain extended operations. Russian logistics could not support an army at that distance long enough to reduce fortifications that strong. 3 failures in 4 years. Most commanders would have given up. Most would have accepted that Kazan was beyond reach and found some diplomatic solution, some way to save face while acknowledging the limits of what was possible. But Ivan was not most commanders, because Ivan understood something that his predecessors, who had failed 10 times before him, had not grasped. The problem was not courage. Russian soldiers were brave. They had proven that by standing in siege lines under artillery fire, by making repeated assaults that were driven back with heavy casualties. The problem was not numbers. Moscow could raise large armies when needed. The problem was not even tactics or training, though those would prove important. The problem was mathematics. The boring, unglamorous mathematics of supply lines and food storage and ammunition reserves and how many tons of grain you needed to feed 100,000 men for 3 months. Wars are not won by heroes charging into battle. Wars are won by the side that can keep its soldiers fed, armed, and healthy long enough to break the enemy's will. And in 1551, after 3 personal failures and studying the reports of 10 previous failed campaigns, Ivan made a decision that would change the future of warfare. He would not march an army to Kazan and hope the logistics worked out. He would solve the logistics problem first, permanently, before committing to the final campaign. He would build a forward operating base, a fortress within striking distance of Kazan that could store supplies, house troops, serve as a permanent staging point for operations, and eliminate the vulnerability of long supply lines that had defeated every previous attempt. But here was the stroke of genius. He would not send engineers to build this fortress on site, working under threat of Tatar attack for months or years. He would build it in advance, 900 kilometers away in the safety of Russian territory. He would then disassemble it completely, transport it down the Volga River, and reassemble it like a massive puzzle right under the nose of his enemy. A prefabricated fortress in 1551. The man Ivan chose for this unprecedented task was Ivan Virodov, a military engineer whose name survives in the historical record only because of this one extraordinary project. We know almost nothing else about him. His background, his training, where he learned the skills to conceive and execute something this ambitious, all lost to time. But what he accomplished speaks for itself. Through the spring and early summer of 1551, teams of workers in the city of Uglich cut and shaped 75,000 logs. Oak primarily chosen for strength and resistance to rot. Each log was cut to specific dimensions based on careful calculations. Each was numbered with Cyrillic markings indicating its exact position in the final structure. Walls, towers, gates, barracks, storage buildings, everything. An entire fortress reduced to coded components that could be shipped separately and assembled on site. The precision required was extraordinary. Remember, this was before standardized measurements, before engineering blueprints as we know them. Virodov was working with tools and techniques that had barely changed since Roman times, creating something that required manufacturing tolerances measured in inches across components that would travel 900 kilometers and be assembled by different crews than those who built them. In late May, the logs were loaded onto river barges, hundreds of barges, forming a fleet that stretched for miles. They began the journey downstream, floating with the current, past Russian towns where people came to the riverbanks to watch this strange armada pass. through empty wilderness where bears and wolves watched from the shores, and finally past Tatar-controlled territory where scouts observed and reported back to Kazan. The Tatars watched this fleet with curiosity, but not alarm. Khan Yadigar Muhammad received reports that the Russians were transporting building materials down the river. He laughed. Let them build their wooden fort. Wood burns. When their supplies run out and they retreat as they always do, we'll burn it to the ground. He did not understand what was actually happening. He did not grasp that the equation was about to change. On an island in the Volga, just 18 miles west of Kazan, Russian workers assembled Virodov's floating fortress in 4 weeks. 4 weeks from the first timber being unloaded to a fully functioning military base. Walls, watchtowers, barracks, capable of housing thousands of troops, armories for weapons storage, granaries that could hold months of food supplies. They named it Sviazhsk. For the first time in Russian history, there was a permanent fortification deep in hostile territory. A base that could support extended operations without requiring a vulnerable supply line stretching hundreds of miles back to Moscow. A staging point that eliminated the logistical problem that had defeated 10 previous campaigns and Ivan's 3 personal attempts. The equation had changed, but Ivan knew that logistics alone would not be enough. Sviazhsk solved one problem, but Kazan's walls were formidable, and its defenders were elite warriors. Traditional siege tactics had failed repeatedly. What Ivan needed was not just a new base of operations. He needed new weapons, new methods, new thinking about how to break a city that had never been broken. Through the winter of 1551 and spring of 1552, preparations intensified. Artillery pieces were gathered from across Russia and purchased from European foundries, not dozens of cannons, 150 pieces, siege bombards that could hurl 36-pound stone shot, medium culverins for sustained bombardment, light falconets for suppressing defenders on the walls. It was an unprecedented concentration of firepower representing years of investment and strategic planning. Engineers were hired from across Europe, specialists from Italy who had studied the fall of Constantinople, Germans who understood the latest developments in artillery and fortification, men who brought with them knowledge that Russia desperately needed if it was to compete with European military powers. And there was one more specialist, an engineer whose real name has been lost to history, but whose work would prove decisive. The Russians called him Butler, possibly indicating English origin, or sometimes Razmysl, which translates as the Wise One. He was an expert in a new and terrible military technology, mining, the art of tunneling under enemy fortifications and using gunpowder to bring them down from below. By June 1552, everything was ready, the forward base that solved the logistics problem, the artillery that could challenge Kazan's defenses, the professional army loyal to the state rather than individual nobles, the specialist engineers who understood modern siege warfare, the new tactics that previous campaigns had lacked. After 10 failures spanning 83 years, after 3 personal failures that had cost Ivan political capital and the lives of thousands, the Tsar was ready for attempt number 11. On June 16, 1552, Ivan Vasilyevich, 22 years old, led 150,000 troops east from Moscow. This time would be different, not because of hope or determination or confidence, all of which previous campaigns had possessed in abundance. This time would be different because Ivan had done something no previous commander had done. He had learned from every failure, had studied what went wrong in each of the 10 previous attempts and in his own 3 disasters, had identified the root causes rather than the surface symptoms, and had systematically addressed each problem with solutions that were innovative, expensive, and in some cases unprecedented in military history. As the massive column marched east through summer heat, crossing rivers and forests, and finally emerging onto the steppe where they could see Kazan's walls rising on the distant horizon, Ivan knew that everything he had endured had led to this moment. All the pain of his childhood watching his mother die and the boyars tear his kingdom apart. All the humiliation of previous defeats, all the years of preparation and planning, and the enormous resources invested in this campaign. 42 days from now, that city would burn. But first, he had to take it. And the men defending those walls, warriors descended from the armies that had conquered half the world, had no intention of making it easy. August 22, 1552. When the Russian army appeared on the horizon south of Kazan, the defenders on the walls did not panic. They had seen this before. 10 times in living memory, Russian armies had come with their banners and their siege engines and their grand ambitions. 10 times those armies had exhausted themselves against these walls and retreated. Why would the 11th time be any different? From the high ramparts of Kazan, Khan Yadigar Muhammad watched the enemy forces deploy across the valley. 150,000 men, certainly the largest army Russia had ever assembled for a single campaign. But size meant nothing if you could not sustain it. Everyone understood the mathematics. Moscow was 800 kilometers away. Supply lines that long could not be maintained indefinitely. The Russians would besiege the city for a few weeks, perhaps a month or two, exhaust their ammunition and food, and then melt away like snow in spring. It had happened before. It would happen again. The walls of Kazan had stood for over a century. They would stand for a century more. But what Khan Yadigar did not know, what he could not see from his vantage point on the walls, was that the equation governing this siege had fundamentally changed. 18 miles to the west, barely half a day's march, sat the fortress of Sviazhsk, a fortress that had not existed a year ago, a fortress filled with grain enough to feed an army for 6 months. Gunpowder and ammunition in quantities that previous campaigns could only dream of. Medical supplies, replacement weapons, everything needed to sustain extended operations. For the first time in this centuries-old struggle, the Russians were not tethered to Moscow by an impossibly long and vulnerable supply line. They could stay as long as necessary, and Khan Yadigar was about to learn what that meant. The siege began not with a dramatic assault, but with something that looked almost boring. Russian troops started digging trenches, long zigzagging trenches that crept toward the city walls like the fingers of a grasping hand. This was a European technique called approaches, developed in the wars of Italy and brought to Russia by Ivan's foreign engineers. The trenches ran not in straight lines, but in a zigzag pattern, each section angled so that defenders on the walls could not fire down the length of the trench. This meant that to hit the diggers, Tatar archers and gunners had to expose themselves to Russian counterfire. From the walls, Tatar defenders shot arrows and fired what cannons they had at the Russian diggers. Men died, certainly, but the trenches crept forward anyway. A few feet each day, methodical and relentless as a tide. And while the defenders focused on these obvious siege works, something else was happening that they could not see. Underground, sappers were beginning excavations that would prove far more dangerous than any surface approach, but that would come later. First, Ivan needed to solve a more immediate problem. Kazan had its own artillery, perhaps 40 or 50 cannons of various sizes mounted on the walls and in defensive towers. These guns could rain fire on any siege works, destroy any tower or ram that tried to approach, and inflict casualties on attacking forces that would make the siege prohibitively expensive in lives. Russian commanders suggested the traditional approach: bombard the walls, create breaches, and assault through them. But Ivan, remembering his 3 previous failures and the reports of 10 campaigns before those, understood that this would lead to the same result. Extended bombardment would exhaust ammunition, the walls would be damaged but not destroyed, and eventually supplies would run low and force a retreat. So Ivan made a decision that seemed strange to his more traditional officers. For the first 8 days of the siege, Russian artillery did not fire at the walls at all. Instead, all 150 cannons concentrated their fire on a single target: Kazan's guns. It was methodical counter-battery fire, a tactic more sophisticated than anything previously attempted in this theater of war. Spotters positioned on high ground would watch for the smoke and flash of Tatar cannons firing. They would note the position, calculate range, and direct Russian gun crews to concentrate fire on those specific points. Bronze shot weighing 36 pounds would smash into stone embrasures, shattering the masonry and sending deadly fragments flying. Wooden gun platforms would splinter under the impact. Earth ramparts would collapse, burying guns and crews. And most devastatingly for morale, Tatar gun crews learned that manning their weapons meant almost certain death. Russian artillery was more numerous, more accurate, and directed by observers who could call fire onto specific positions with terrifying precision. Day after day, the bombardment continued. Not scattered fire, but concentrated trauma focused on eliminating Kazan's ability to respond. By August 29th, 1 week into the siege, Kazan's heavy artillery had effectively been silenced, not destroyed entirely, but suppressed. Gun crews too terrified to man their positions for more than a few minutes at a time. Cannons too damaged or buried to fire with any accuracy. The walls were still intact, but Kazan's teeth had been pulled, and now Ivan could move his secret weapon into position. The battery tower. This was Ivan Virodov's second masterpiece, after Sviazhsk. It was not a traditional siege tower, those tall wooden structures meant to bring attacking troops level with the walls so they could cross over. This was something conceptually different, an artillery platform, a vertical fortress designed for a single purpose, to deliver concentrated firepower at close range. 13 meters high, the tower rose in 3 distinct levels. The top platform, protected by thick oak planking and reinforced with earth fill, could hold 10 heavy siege bombards. The middle level held 50 lighter culverins. The bottom level housed 200 Streltsy musketeers. The entire structure was sheathed in wet hides to resist fire arrows and topped with a sloped roof to deflect plunging fire from the walls. The engineering challenges were staggering. The completed tower weighed approximately 80 tons. It had to be stable enough to serve as a firing platform for artillery that would create tremendous recoil forces. It had to be mobile, capable of being moved into position despite its immense weight. And it had to be constructed and deployed while under sporadic fire from walls that, even with reduced artillery capability, could still inflict damage. The construction happened over 3 nights. Russian carpenters worked by torchlight behind mobile wooden screens that blocked direct observation from the walls. The tower rose in sections, each piece carefully fitted to the next, the entire structure taking shape like a bizarre wooden cathedral dedicated to destruction. Tatar defenders could hear the hammering, the shouts of workers coordinating the placement of massive timbers, but they could not see what was being built. And their cannons, those few that remained operational, could not effectively target what they could not see. Sporadic fire slammed into the protective screens and occasionally killed workers, but it could not stop the construction. On the 4th night, September 1st, with Kazan's artillery still suppressed and largely unable to respond, teams of men and oxen began moving the completed tower into position. It was an engineering feat that deserved to be celebrated in its own right. Ropes as thick as a man's arm, hundreds of them, attached to a wooden frame built around the tower's base. Massive oak rollers, each one cut and shaped to precise dimensions, laid in sequence ahead of the tower. Teams of oxen straining against the weight. Inch by agonizing inch through the pre-dawn darkness, the tower moved forward. Men died when ropes snapped under the strain and lashed out like whips. Others were crushed when the tower shifted unexpectedly on the rollers, but it moved. By dawn, the battery tower stood 400 meters from Kazan's northwest wall, close enough that every shot from its 60 guns would tell, far enough that it was outside the effective range of most defensive fire the Tatars could still muster. And then it opened fire. 60 cannons firing in coordinated salvos at the same section of wall. Not scattered bombardment, but focused destruction concentrated on a single point: the northwest wall segment between the Arsk Gate and the Nogai Gate. Modern artillery doctrine would call this suppressive fire, creating such a volume of shot that defenders cannot effectively respond. Hour after hour, day after day, bronze and iron shot slammed into oak logs and packed earth. The wall did not collapse immediately. It was not designed to. These walls were 4.5 meters thick at the base, constructed with oak logs set vertically and backed with compacted earth designed to absorb artillery fire by flexing rather than shattering like stone. But nothing built by human hands can absorb punishment forever. The logs began to splinter. The earth fill began to shift and settle as repeated impacts compressed it. Cracks appeared, small at first, barely noticeable, then wider as each successive impact found and exploited weaknesses. Inside the city, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The constant bombardment meant no one could sleep. The thunder of guns firing and shot impacting never stopped, a ceaseless assault on hearing and nerves that drove some defenders mad. Buildings near the northwest wall were being demolished by stray shots that cleared the ramparts. Fires broke out regularly as hot shot ignited thatched roofs. Food was still adequate. Kazan's granaries held supplies for months of siege, but water was becoming a growing concern. The summer heat was brutal, temperatures reaching into the 90s during the day. Maintaining adequate hydration for 10,000 defenders plus 20,000 civilians required enormous quantities of water. Fortunately, from the defenders' perspective, Kazan had a secret that had sustained it through previous sieges. Deep beneath the citadel, accessible through a hidden shaft known only to a few, was an underground spring. Fresh water that bubbled up from some aquifer far below, pure and cold even in the heat of summer. This spring was why Kazan could endure months of encirclement when other fortresses would have been forced to surrender in weeks. Previous Russian campaigns had not even known it existed. The defenders rationed food carefully, but water they had in what seemed like inexhaustible supply. But while Russian artillery pounded the visible walls above ground, another battle was being fought in the darkness below, a battle that most of the defenders did not even know was happening. The man directing this subterranean war was known to the Russians as Ruthlessly, the Wise One. His real name has been lost to history. Some chronicles call him Butler, suggesting English origin. Others hint at German or Hungarian background. What matters is not his nationality, but his expertise in a specialty that was transforming siege warfare across Europe. He was a mining engineer, and in the 16th century, military miners were among the most feared specialists in any army. The principle of military mining was straightforward enough. You dig a tunnel under the enemy's fortification. You shore up the tunnel with wooden supports as you go. You pack the end of the tunnel with barrels of gunpowder. You lay fuses. You light them. The powder explodes. The supports give way. The tunnel collapses. And everything above it, walls and towers and defenders, comes crashing down into the void. Simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult and dangerous in execution. The tunnels had to be deep enough to avoid detection by defenders listening for the sounds of digging, but shallow enough that the explosion would affect structures on the surface. They had to be wide enough for men to work, but narrow enough to minimize the risk of premature collapse. They had to be ventilated, or the miners would suffocate in the stale air or be overcome by the smell of their own waste in those confined spaces. And, most critically, they had to be kept secret. If defenders discovered a tunnel, they could dig a countermine to intercept it. The resulting underground combat, fought in near total darkness in spaces where you couldn't swing a sword effectively, was the stuff of nightmares for anyone who had experienced it. Rosmissel's first target was not the walls themselves. It was that hidden spring, Kazan's secret weapon against extended sieges. His scouts and informants, including Tatar prisoners who were induced to talk through various means, had learned of the spring's existence. They did not know its exact location, only that it was somewhere beneath the citadel. Rosmissel reasoned that if he could find it and destroy it, he could break the city's will more effectively than any amount of artillery fire against the walls. For 3 weeks starting in early August, mining teams worked in rotating shifts around the clock. The work was hellish beyond anything most of those men had experienced. They dug exploratory tunnels, probing beneath Kazan's foundations like blind worms seeking prey. The tunnels were barely 3 meters high at best, forcing men to work bent over or on their knees for hours at a time. The air was thick and stale, barely breathable. Candles provided the only light, their flames burning dimly in the oxygen-depleted atmosphere. Cave-ins killed workers periodically, their bodies sometimes left buried because extracting them would risk collapsing the entire tunnel. The psychological stress of laboring in complete darkness, knowing that at any moment the earth might crush you or that Tatar counterminers might break through and attack, drove some men to breakdown. There are accounts of miners emerging from shifts unable to speak, trembling uncontrollably, refusing to go back down no matter what threats or inducements were offered. But on August 27th, a team broke through into a natural cavern. Water pooled at the bottom, flowing from cracks in the rock. An underground stream feeding the spring that supplied Kazan. Rosmissel himself went down to verify, descending into that darkness to study what his men had found. He emerged hours later, covered in mud and limestone dust, and reported to Ivan. They had found it. The source of Kazan's water supply lay exposed and vulnerable. 3 days later, on August 30th, the mine was ready. 14 barrels of gunpowder, carefully positioned throughout the cavern to maximize the effect. Each barrel held approximately 45 kilograms of explosive. Total charge, over 600 kilograms. Rosmissel supervised the placement of every barrel personally, calculating angles and distances to ensure the explosion would bring down the cavern ceiling and collapse the entire underground water system. The fuses were laid with meticulous care. Men were evacuated from the tunnel, guards posted to ensure no one accidentally wandered into the danger zone. At noon on August 30th, 8 days into the siege, Rosmissel lit the fuse himself. The explosion was not visible from the surface, not directly. There was no fireball, no column of smoke rising into the sky, but everyone in Kazan felt it, a deep subsonic rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Buildings shook, plaster cracked and fell from the walls. People stumbled as the ground itself seemed to shift beneath their feet like the deck of a ship in heavy seas. In the citadel, the hidden shaft that had supplied the spring for over a century now led only to a collapsed ruin of broken stone and mud. The cavern had been destroyed, the stream diverted or buried, the spring that had sustained Kazan through previous sieges gone forever. Khan Yadigar sent men to investigate. When they reported what had happened, the full implication became clear. The Russians had not just brought cannons and soldiers. They had brought specialists who could attack from below, who could strike at the invisible foundations of the city's strength, who understood siege warfare at a level that the Tatars could not match. From that moment forward, every drop of water in Kazan had to be carefully rationed from dwindling reserves. In 90-degree heat, with 10,000 warriors and 20,000 civilians to supply. The mathematics were brutal and obvious to everyone. Without water, the city could not hold out for months, perhaps not even for weeks. For the first time since the siege began, genuine doubt crept into the Khan's mind. But surrender remained unthinkable. To surrender meant the end of Tatar independence on the Volga. It meant becoming subjects of Moscow, a reversal of the natural order that had prevailed for 3 centuries. Better to fight and die with honor. The defenders fought on with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed but refused to accept it. September passed in a blur of artillery fire and increasingly desperate sorties. The Tatars made 7 major attempts to sally forth from the gates, to attack Russian siege works, to set fire to the battery tower, to break the encirclement and escape. Each attempt was driven back by the disciplined volley fire of the Streltsy. Those professional musketeers, trained to load and fire in coordinated ranks, could put down a curtain of lead shot that cavalry could not penetrate. The Tatars would charge out from a gate, 500 horsemen thundering toward Russian lines, and be met by volleys that dropped horses and riders in windrows. Those who got close enough to engage in melee would find themselves facing pikemen in formation, 20-foot spears leveled, impossible to break without taking catastrophic casualties. On the walls, conditions became desperate. The section under constant bombardment from the battery tower was visibly failing. The logs were shattered in places, the earth fill crumbling, visible gaps appearing where determined attackers might force entry. Water ration had been reduced to a cup per person per day. In the heat, men were collapsing from dehydration even while standing guard. Food was still available, but without water to cook with, much of it was inedible. Disease began to spread. Dysentery first, from contaminated water, as people were forced to drink from any source they could find. Then typhus, spreading through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. The sweet, terrible smell of death hung over the city, and everyone knew it would only get worse. Still, Khan Yadigar refused to yield. On September 15th, Ivan sent envoys. Tatar prisoners who had been captured in the early skirmishes were released and sent back to the city with a message: "Surrender now, and lives will be spared." The defenders can march out with honor. Civilians will be allowed to evacuate unmolested. Continue to resist, and when the city falls, no quarter will be given. The envoys approached the gates under a flag of truce. They called out their message to the defenders on the walls, speaking loudly enough to be heard by the hundreds of people gathered to listen. Khan Yadigar's response was to order his archers to shoot them down, his own people. Tatars who had fought for Kazan and been captured through no fault of their own, shot full of arrows and left to die in the dust before the gates they had once defended. The message was unmistakable: "We do not negotiate, we fight to the end." When word of this reached the Russian camp, Ivan's commanders were shocked. To kill prisoners attempting to deliver terms of surrender violated every norm of civilized warfare. It was an act of such desperate defiance that it revealed how close the defenders were to breaking. But it also told Ivan that the siege needed to end soon. The longer it dragged on, the more likely disease would spread to his own camp. Autumn rains would turn the siege works to impassable mud. Some relief force might materialize from the other khanates or from allies in the Caucasus. He consulted with Ruthlessly. The English engineer had not been idle since destroying the water supply. For the past month, his teams had been digging new tunnels, working from multiple entry points to create a network of approaches beneath Kazan's defenses. On September 30th, Ruthlessly reported that the mines were complete. Not one tunnel. 11 separate mines converging on critical points in Kazan's defenses. The main northwest wall that had been weakened by weeks of artillery fire. The Arsk Gate to the north. The Nogai Gate to the east. The inner citadel wall that protected the heart of the city. Each mine terminated in a chamber packed with barrels of gunpowder. Some chambers held 2 barrels. Others held 6 or 8. The main mine beneath the northwest wall held 12 barrels, over 500 kilograms of explosive positioned to bring down a section of fortification 50 meters wide. Total gunpowder, 48 barrels. Approximately 2,160 kilograms of explosive force positioned at critical structural points beneath the city. The fuses were laid in an interconnected network, carefully designed so that a single ignition point could trigger a cascade of explosions, each detonation lighting additional fuses that would fire more mines in sequence. "When do you want to fire them, my lord?" Ruthlessly asked. Ivan stood at the edge of his command position, looking toward the city. Smoke rose from fires burning in the residential quarters. The walls showed visible damage from weeks of bombardment. Logs splintered and earth ramparts collapsed in places. The stench of death and disease carried on the wind, even at this distance. He thought about the 3-year-old boy who had watched his father die, who had been abandoned by those who should have protected him. He thought about the 10 failed campaigns, the 83 years of defeat stretching back before his birth. He thought about 300 years of Russian princes kneeling before Mongol Khans, paying tribute, asking permission to rule their own lands. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "at dawn." That night, September 30th going into October 1st, was eerily quiet. Russian artillery ceased firing for the first time in weeks. The constant thunder that had become like background noise to everyone on both sides went suddenly silent. In Kazan, exhausted defenders allowed themselves a moment of desperate hope. Perhaps the siege was ending. Perhaps the Russians were running low on powder and shot. Perhaps they would withdraw like all the others before them. But at midnight, Russian priests moved through the siege works, blessing the troops and offering final prayers. Soldiers checked their weapons with more care than usual, sharpening blades that were already sharp, testing bowstrings and musket mechanisms. Officers reviewed assault plans, reminding men of their positions and objectives. Every soldier knew his assignment, knew which breach he would attack through when the time came. In his command tent, Ivan did not sleep. Some chroniclers say he spent the entire night in prayer, kneeling before an icon of the Virgin, begging for victory and forgiveness for what was about to happen. Others suggest he reviewed tactical plans with his commanders, making final adjustments to the assault. Still others claim he sat alone in the darkness, staring at maps that he had long since memorized, contemplating the weight of the decision he had made. Where was Ivan during all of this? During the 42 days of siege, during the bombardment and the mining and the incremental progress toward this final moment? He was not at the front lines. He was not on the trenches, directing artillery fire. He was not underground supervising the miners. He was in his tent, planning, praying, deciding. Some historians view this as appropriate. A commander's job is not to risk his life in tactical minutiae. It is to make strategic decisions that thousands will execute. Ivan's presence in a removed position allowed him to see the entire battlefield, to receive reports from multiple sectors, to make adjustments and issue orders based on the full picture rather than one limited perspective. Others see weakness. A young man, 22 years old, terrified by the violence he has set in motion, hiding behind prayer while other men die executing his orders. A commander who lacks the courage to share the risks he demands of his soldiers. The truth likely falls somewhere between. Ivan was young. He had survived a traumatic childhood that left scars. He was orchestrating the largest and most complex military operation in Russian history. And he understood, perhaps better than his critics, that his death in some meaningless skirmish would undo everything. So he stayed in the tent, made the hard decisions, and let others do the dying. But on this night, the night before the final assault, there was no hiding. He was alone with the knowledge of what tomorrow would bring: the explosions, the assault, the desperate fighting in the streets, the massacre that would inevitably follow when soldiers, their blood up after weeks of siege, poured into a city that had refused every offer of mercy. At 4 a.m, the order went out through the camp: prepare for assault. By 5, 150,000 men stood ready. Streltsy musketeers in the front ranks, their weapons loaded, slow matches burning, ready to advance through whatever breaches the explosions created. Pike formations behind them, their 20-foot spears a forest of sharpened steel. Cavalry on the flanks, ready to pursue any defenders who tried to flee or to encircle the city and cut off escape routes. At 5:30, Rosmeisel and his senior mining officers entered the main tunnel for a final inspection. They moved through the darkness with practiced ease, men who had spent weeks in these passages and knew every twist and turn. They checked each fuse connection, ensuring the network was intact, that each mine would fire when triggered. This had to work perfectly. If even one explosion failed, if even one breach did not materialize, the assault could bog down into a grinding street fight that would cost thousands of Russian lives and might still fail to take the city. At 5:45, they emerged from the tunnel. Rosmeisel, covered in dirt and limestone dust, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion and tension, reported to Ivan, "The fuses are laid, my lord, on your command." Ivan looked east. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. In Kazan, the city was still mostly dark, just a few torches burning on the walls where exhausted sentries kept watch, perhaps thinking that another day of siege would pass like all the others before it. He thought about what would happen in the next few hours. The explosions that would tear gaps in walls that had stood for over a century. The assault that would pour Russian soldiers into those gaps. The desperate fighting as Tatar defenders made their last stand. The massacre that would follow because soldiers who have watched their comrades die for 42 days do not show mercy when they finally breach the walls. He could still call it off. Could offer terms one more time. Could try to find some solution that did not involve the utter destruction of a city and the slaughter of thousands. But Khan Yadigar had shot the last envoys Ivan sent, had made clear that the only terms he would accept were no terms at all. And this was not just about one city. This was about breaking the last symbol of Mongol power, about sending a message to every Khanate, every steppe confederacy, every potential enemy that Russia was no longer prey, that the days of tribute and subordination were finished, that there was a new power in Eastern Europe and it would not be denied. "Light the fuses," Ivan said. Rosmissel nodded once, turned, walked back to the tunnel entrance where his officers waited, took a slow match, burning cord that glowed orange in the pre-dawn darkness, from an assistant's hand. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, on October 2nd, 1552, he touched the flame to the main fuse line. The fuse burned at roughly 1 foot per minute. The tunnels were hundreds of feet long. It would take time for the fire to reach the powder chambers, minutes that stretched like hours as 150,000 men stood in tense silence, waiting for the earth to erupt. Russian soldiers watched the city walls, seeing nothing different yet, waiting for the signal that would send them forward. In Kazan, some sentries on the walls reported seeing smoke rising from holes in the ground outside the fortifications, thin wisps that they could not explain. A few smelled something strange, the acrid scent of burning fuse cord. In the tunnels beneath the city, 11 separate fuses crept toward 11 separate powder magazines, each one bringing fire to barrels packed with enough explosive force to bring down stone and timber and earth. And then at 6:03 in the morning, the first mine detonated beneath the Arsk gate. The sound was like the earth itself screaming. The explosion came from beneath the Arsk gate. Imagine standing on solid ground when suddenly the earth beneath your feet simply ceases to exist. That is what happened to the defenders on that section of wall. One moment they were standing watch in the pre-dawn light. The next moment the world turned inside out. 2,000 kilograms of gunpowder detonating in a confined space underground does not simply make noise. It creates a shock wave that liquefies internal organs, that turns stone to shrapnel, that sends entire sections of fortification 50 feet into the air. The explosion at the Arsk gate opened a breach 30 meters wide. Timbers that had stood for a century were reduced to splinters in an instant. Earth that had been compressed into defensive ramparts scattered across the landscape like grain from a torn sack. Defenders on that wall did not have time to scream. They simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the initial blast or crushed beneath tons of falling debris. 3 seconds later, the second mine detonated. The Nogai Gate. Another massive breach, this one 40 meters wide, the gate itself and the towers flanking it collapsing into a crater that would swallow a house. And 4 seconds after that, the third explosion, the inner citadel wall. A cascading failure as underground chambers collapsed in sequence, bringing down foundations that had supported the city's strongest fortifications. From 3 miles away, Ivan watched the city erupt. He had witnessed artillery bombardments before, had seen the damage that conventional weapons could inflict. But this was something else. This was the earth itself opening to swallow the works of man. Dust clouds rose hundreds of feet into the air, blotting out the rising sun. The sound rolled across the valley like continuous thunder, echoing off distant hills, seeming to come from everywhere at once. And then came the screaming. not from the explosions themselves, but from the thousands of people inside the city who had survived the initial blasts but now understood what was coming next. Russian trumpets sounded the advance. 150,000 men began moving toward the city, not in a mad rush, not in an undisciplined charge, but in organized formations. Streltsy in the front ranks, their arquebuses loaded, slow matches burning. Pike formations behind them, 20-foot spears leveled. Cavalry on the flanks, ready to encircle and cut off escape routes. They poured through the three breaches like water through a broken dam. What followed was 12 hours of the most brutal urban combat of the 16th century. This was not glorious battle. This was not knights in armor clashing on open fields. This was house-to-house, room-to-room killing in spaces so confined that men could barely swing their weapons. Tatar defenders, those who had survived the explosions, fell back into the city streets. Their advantage had always been mobility, speed, the ability to strike from horseback and vanish before the enemy could respond. But in narrow alleys, in streets clogged with rubble and panicked civilians, their horses could not maneuver. The finest light cavalry in the world found themselves fighting on foot in conditions that nullified every tactical advantage they possessed. And they fought anyway. They fought because they understood what was happening. This was not just a battle for a city, this was the end of their world. Kazan had been founded 114 years ago as a statement of Tatar power, a deliberate demonstration that Mongol successor states could thrive on Russia's borders. It had survived a dozen sieges. It had extracted tribute from Russian princes. It had been a symbol that even in decline, the heirs of Genghis Khan remained formidable. Now that symbol was burning. Tatar warriors formed defensive positions at every intersection, behind every barricade they could hastily construct. They fought with the desperation of men who knew that surrender meant slavery at best, execution at worst. Russian troops advanced block by block, using their Streltsy musketeers to devastating effect. The professional soldiers would form firing lines, pour volleys into Tatar positions, advance while the defenders reloaded. Repeat. It was mechanical. It was efficient. It was merciless. Civilians were caught in the middle. 20,000 people who had thought themselves safe behind those massive walls now found their homes becoming battlegrounds. Some tried to flee through the breaches, only to be cut down by Russian cavalry waiting outside. Some barricaded themselves in cellars and prayed. Some, incredibly, fought back. Chronicles mention women throwing stones from rooftops, old men attacking Russian soldiers with whatever tools they could find, children trying to help their fathers reload weapons. At the Grand Mosque in the city center, a Tatar religious leader named Kol Sharif made his last stand. He was a scholar, a teacher, the head of the city's main madrasa. When Russian troops approached the mosque, Sharif and approximately 300 of his students barricaded themselves inside. They were not soldiers, they were intellectuals, men who had dedicated their lives to study and prayer. But they fought like soldiers. For 3 hours, Russian troops tried to take the mosque. Every assault was driven back by defenders who knew the building's layout, who fought from behind pillars and in corridors, who used the architecture itself as a weapon. Sharif himself directed the defense, moving from position to position, encouraging his students, praying between attacks. When it became clear that the mosque could not be held, Sharif retreated to the library. Thousands of manuscripts collected over generations, works of theology and philosophy and science. The accumulated learning of Tatar Islamic culture. Russian troops finally broke through the final defenses around 2 in the afternoon. They found Sharif in the library, surrounded by books, a sword in his hand. He was not a young man, not a warrior. But he stood over the manuscripts he had spent his life preserving, and he died defending them. The library burned, the mosque burned, the entire district around it burned. By mid-afternoon, organized Tatar resistance had collapsed. Khan Yadigar Muhammad was found hiding in a cellar, captured alive, though most of his personal guard died defending him. The leading Nogai generals surrendered when they realized the battle was lost. Some defenders tried to flee north into the forests beyond the city. Most were hunted down and killed by Russian cavalry. A few escaped to spread word of what had happened. By sunset, Kazan had fallen. What came next was the part that is hardest to talk about, the part that makes the story complicated. Because what happened in the hours and days after the city fell was both liberation and atrocity, salvation and genocide, all tangled together in ways that make simple moral judgments impossible. Russian troops, their blood up after 42 days of siege and 12 hours of desperate fighting, poured through the city in a frenzy of violence. Most Tatar men of military age were killed outright. No trials, no mercy, just execution. Buildings were looted and burned, mosques were destroyed. The physical infrastructure of Tatar Islamic culture in Kazan was systematically dismantled. But at the same time, in the slave markets and holding pens scattered throughout the city, Russian soldiers found something else: prisoners. Between 60,000 and 100,000 Russian civilians who had been captured in raids over the years and held as slaves. Some had been in Kazan for decades. Some had been children when they were taken and were now middle-aged adults who barely remembered their homeland. Some had forgotten how to speak Russian. They were freed. Imagine being a slave for 20 years. Imagine the day you wake up and your captors are dead, and men speaking your half-remembered language are breaking your chains. Is that liberation? Yes, absolutely. For those 60,000 people, October 2nd, 1552, was the day their nightmare ended. But imagine being a Tatar civilian who never owned slaves, who never raided Russian villages, who was simply living your life in the city of your birth when foreign soldiers burst through the gates and began killing everyone who looked like a potential threat. For you, October 2nd, 1552 was the day your world ended. Both of these things are true. Both of these experiences happened simultaneously in the same city on the same day. And any honest accounting of what happened at Kazan has to hold both truths at once, has to resist the urge to simplify the story into heroes and villains. The final death toll was staggering. 10,000 Tatar defenders killed, approximately 30,000 civilians dead in the fighting and subsequent massacre. Against this, 60 to 100,000 Russians freed from slavery. The mathematics of suffering do not balance. They never do. Lives are not fungible. Pain is not a currency that can be traded and reconciled. 4 days after the city fell on October 6th, Ivan entered Kazan for the first time. He rode through streets still choked with bodies, through districts still smoldering. He went directly to the site of the Grand Mosque, where Kol Sharif had made his final stand. And there, on the ashes of that mosque, Ivan ordered the construction of an Orthodox church. It was a statement. The old order is gone. The new order has arrived. The cross now stands where the crescent once did. And, to make the symbolism even more explicit, Ivan decreed that going forward, Russian churches would display a new symbol, an Orthodox cross mounted atop an Islamic crescent. The message could not have been clearer. We have defeated you. We have supplanted you. We are literally standing on top of your religion. The Tatar population of Kazan, those who survived, were expelled from the city. Not killed, not enslaved, but forced to leave and resettle in outlying areas. New Russian colonists were brought in to repopulate the city. Within a generation, Kazan had been transformed from a Tatar Muslim capital into a Russian Orthodox administrative center. But the story does not end with the fall of one city, because Kazan was not just a city. It was a symbol, a test case, a proof of concept. And what happened there echoed across the entire region for decades to come. The fall of Kazan proved something that military theorists had been debating for years. European siege technology was superior to steppe cavalry tactics. For 3 centuries, Mongol and Tatar forces had dominated battlefields through mobility, through the devastating effectiveness of mounted archers who could strike and fade before heavy infantry could respond. But against fortifications, against cannons, Against professional musketeers in defensive positions, that advantage evaporated. Kazan fell not because Tatar warriors lacked courage. They fought to the death. It fell because the nature of warfare was changing, and the institutional knowledge required to wage modern siege warfare had shifted decisively toward European powers. Artillery, engineering, logistics, these were the new decisive factors, and they favored states with centralized bureaucracies and professional armies over tribal confederations based on warrior culture. 4 years later, in 1556, the Khanate of Astrakhan fell to Russian forces. The campaign lasted barely 3 months. The defenders of Astrakhan had seen what happened at Kazan. They knew resistance was futile. The siege was almost perfunctory. Within a few decades, Siberia, the last major Khanate, also collapsed. The age of steppe empires was over. With Kazan and Astrakhan under Russian control, the entire Volga River from source to mouth was now in Russian hands. This was not just about military conquest. It was about economics. The Volga was the most important trade artery in Eastern Europe. It connected the Baltic to the Caspian, the north to the south, Europe to Central Asia. Control of the Volga meant control of trade routes that had enriched civilizations for 1,000 years. But more than trade, it opened the East. Just 3 decades after Kazan fell, in the 1580s, Russian fur trappers and Cossack adventurers began crossing the Ural Mountains into Siberia. Within 50 years, they had reached the Yenisei River, 2,000 kilometers into the Asian continent. By 1639, less than a century after Kazan, Russian explorers stood on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Think about that timeline. From Kazan to the Pacific in 87 years, the entire width of Asia. A continental expansion that took other European powers centuries to accomplish across much smaller distances. And it all began with the decision to build a prefabricated fortress 18 miles from a Tatar city in 1551. Russia today is the largest country in the world by area, 11 time zones, stretching from the Arctic to Central Asia, from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. That expansion began here, with Ivan and his engineers and his willingness to think differently about how to solve a problem that had defeated 10 previous attempts. But there was a darker legacy as well. With the conquest of Kazan, Russia became something it had never been before, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. For the first time, Moscow ruled over large populations of non-Russians, non-Orthodox Christians, Tatars, Bashkirs, Chuvash, Mari, Udmurts, peoples with their own languages, their own religions, their own cultures. Some of these groups were Muslim, some followed ancestral spiritual traditions. Now they all lived under the rule of a Russian Orthodox state that viewed them, at best, as subjects to be converted, and at worst, as conquered enemies to be controlled. This was the birth of the imperial system that would define Russia for the next 400 years. The system that would expand to include Poles and Finns and Ukrainians and Georgians and dozens of other peoples. The system that would create an empire second only to the British in size and diversity, but also the system that would generate centuries of ethnic tension, forced assimilation, cultural suppression, and ultimately the violent fractures that would tear the empire apart in the 20th century. For the Tatars specifically, October 2nd remains a complicated date. In modern Tatarstan, which is now a federal subject within the Russian Federation, some Tatars mark this day as the Day of Remembrance and Sorrow, a commemoration of those who died defending their independence against foreign conquest. The Russian government banned public rallies on this date in 2021. The official reason given was prevention of ethnic tensions. But the underlying message was clear. The state does not want public expressions of grief over events that the state considers legitimate historical conquests. Even today, 500 years later, the fall of Kazan remains contested memory. Victory and tragedy, inseparable. Each perspective valid, each containing truth. And what of Ivan himself? What happened to the 22-year-old who engineered this victory? In the immediate aftermath, he was celebrated as a hero. News of Kazan's fall spread across Russia. Church bells rang. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered. And adding to the joy, word arrived that Ivan's wife, Anastasia, had given birth to a son, an heir. The dynasty was secure, though the boy did not live long. That son would die in infancy, one of many personal tragedies that would mark Ivan's later years. To commemorate the victory, Ivan commissioned the construction of a cathedral on Red Square in Moscow. You know this building. Even if you have never been to Russia, you have seen pictures of it. St. Basil's Cathedral, with its distinctive colorful domes, its almost hallucinogenic blend of architectural styles. Look closely at that building and you see something interesting. It is not purely Russian Orthodox architecture. It incorporates elements from the conquered Tatar territories. Islamic arches, Central Asian motifs. It is a physical representation of what Russia had become, a fusion of cultures, a multi-ethnic empire symbolized in stone and paint. But Ivan's personal story does not have a happy ending. In the years after Kazan, something broke in him. Perhaps it was always broken, the trauma of his childhood simply waiting for the right conditions to metastasize. Perhaps the violence of the siege, the responsibility for tens of thousands of deaths, the weight of command, changed him in ways he could not recover from. He became paranoid, brutal, unstable. In the 1560s, he created the Oprichnina, a state within a state, a separate territory under his direct control, patrolled by a force of secret police who answered only to him. These men, the Oprichniki, terrorized the Russian nobility. They conducted raids on estates. They tortured suspected traitors. They killed thousands in fits of paranoid rage as Ivan saw conspiracies everywhere. He destroyed the city of Novgorod in 1570 based on dubious accusations of treason, killing as many as 15,000 people in 5 weeks of organized massacres. And in 1581, in a moment of fury that has haunted Russian memory ever since, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir with an iron-pointed staff during an argument. The blow was fatal. Ivan Ivanovich died days later from the head wound. The dynasty's heir, killed by his own father in a moment of uncontrolled rage. That is why we call him Ivan the Terrible. The Russian word is Grozny, which translates more accurately as formidable or awe-inspiring. But the English got it right too, because yes, he was formidable. Yes, he broke Mongol power and laid the foundation for an empire, but he was also terrible in the truest sense, inspiring terror, causing suffering on a massive scale, becoming, in the end, the thing he had fought against. There is a famous painting by Ilya Repin showing Ivan holding his dying son, the old Tsar's face twisted in anguish as he realizes what he has done. It is one of the most powerful images in Russian art because it captures something essential about power and violence and the cost they exact from those who wield them. Ivan died in 1584, 32 years after Kazan fell. He was 53 years old. His reign had transformed Russia from a regional power into an empire. But it had also demonstrated the dangers of absolute power, unchecked by institutions, the way trauma can metastasize into cruelty, the price that success sometimes demands from those who achieve it. So what are we supposed to take from all of this? What are the lessons that reach across 500 years? Let me offer 3. First, technology changes equations. For 300 years, the fundamental equation of warfare in Eastern Europe favored steppe cavalry. Fast, mobile, devastating in the right conditions. Mongol and Tatar forces built empires based on that advantage. But when the technology changed, when cannons and gunpowder and professional infantry became the decisive factors, suddenly what had been invincible became vulnerable. This is not just true in warfare, it is true in everything: business, technology, personal life. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. The ability to recognize when fundamental conditions have changed, when old advantages no longer apply, when you need to adapt or die, that ability determines survival. Ivan was not the best general. He probably was not even in the top 10 of his era, but he was willing to learn from failure. He was willing to adopt new technologies. He was willing to change methods. That is why he succeeded where 10 previous commanders failed. Second, logistics wins wars. Not heroism, not courage, not tactical brilliance. Boring, unglamorous logistics. The stories we tell about warfare focus on dramatic moments. The charge, the last stand, the heroic sacrifice. And those moments matter. Courage matters. But what actually determines outcomes is the ability to keep soldiers fed and armed and healthy long enough to break the enemy's will. Ivan won at Kazan not because Russian soldiers were braver than Tatar defenders. He won because he solved the supply line problem that had defeated 10 previous campaigns. He built Sviazhsk, a forward operating base that let his army sustain operations at a distance that had previously been impossible. That is not dramatic. That is engineering and planning and meticulous preparation. But that is what wins. In your own life, the same principle applies. Success usually does not come from grand gestures or dramatic moments. It comes from consistent, disciplined preparation over time, from solving the boring problems that other people ignore, from building the infrastructure that lets you sustain effort when motivation fades. Third, victory has a cost. Every empire begins with someone else's tragedy. For Moscow, Kazan's fall was a beginning, the first step toward becoming a great power. Liberation for 60,000 slaves. Proof that Russia could stand as an equal to any European state. A moment of national triumph. For the Tatars, it was an ending. The loss of independence. The beginning of centuries living under foreign rule. The destruction of their capital and the suppression of their culture. A moment of national catastrophe. This duality is inescapable. The same smoke carried both meanings. The same explosions that freed Russian slaves buried Tatar families. History is not a clean ledger where good and evil can be separated into neat columns. We live in an age that wants simple stories, heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys, clear moral lines. But history is not simple. History is complicated and messy and full of moments where the same event is triumph for one group and tragedy for another. Was the fall of Kazan good? It depends on who you ask. The freed Russian slaves would say yes. The Tatar defenders who died on the walls would say no. And both answers would be correct. We should remember that when we study history. We should remember that every victory requires someone else to lose. Every empire is built on the ruins of something that came before. Every triumph costs someone their world. That does not mean we cannot celebrate achievements or acknowledge progress. But it does mean we should do so with humility, with awareness of complexity, with memory for those who paid the price. On October 2nd, 1552, on a hill overlooking the Volga River, a city fell. The last major remnant of Mongol power in Europe was extinguished. A young Tsar proved that determination and adaptation and meticulous preparation could overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. From the ashes of that city, an empire rose that would stretch from Poland to the Pacific, from the Arctic to Central Asia. An empire that would shape world history for centuries. But in those same ashes were the bodies of 40,000 people who died defending their home. The ruins of a culture that would never again be independent. The seeds of ethnic tensions that echo even today. These legacies exist simultaneously, inseparable, each true in its own right. The story of Kazan reminds us that history is made in defining moments when leaders face impossible choices, when technology reshapes the possible, when old orders give way to new ones. It reminds us that such moments have consequences that ripple forward through centuries in ways we cannot predict or control. And it reminds us that the same event can be both beginning and ending, triumph and tragedy, liberation and conquest, all at the same time. History is not simple. History is complex. And if we are honest, we should remember it that way. So let me ask you, what struck you most about this story? Was it the engineering brilliance of Sviazhsk and those 11 mines packed with 48 barrels of gunpowder? The sheer audacity of floating a fortress 900 kilometers down a river and assembling it under enemy observation? Was it the human cost? 40,000 dead, 60,000 freed. Kol Sharif dying in a library surrounded by the manuscripts he had dedicated his life to preserving. The Tatar children who watched their world burn. The Russian slaves who saw daylight after 20 years in darkness. Or was it the long-term consequences? The way one siege in 1552 set Russia on a path to the Pacific. The way it created a multi-ethnic empire that would struggle with that legacy for 5 centuries. The way it proved that technology and logistics matter more than courage when the fundamental conditions of warfare change. I want to hear your thoughts. What part of this story made you think? What part challenged your assumptions about how we remember history, about how we weigh victory against cost, about the complexity of judging events from 500 years in the past? Drop a comment below. Tell me what resonated with you. Tell me what you disagreed with. Tell me what questions this raised that you want to explore further. And if this made you think, if it challenged you to see history as more than simple narratives of heroes and villains, share it with someone who would appreciate that depth, someone who wants substance over headlines, someone who understands that the most important stories are the ones that refuse to be simple, because that is what history should be. Not comfortable, not easy, but true in all its complexity. That is what we owe to the people who lived through these moments, the ones who won and the ones who lost, the ones who celebrated and the ones who mourned, the ones whose names we remember and the thousands whose names are lost to time, but who were there, who experienced it, who shaped it with their choices and their suffering and their brief moments of triumph. We owe them the truth, all of it, the parts we are proud of and the parts that make us uncomfortable, the victories and the costs, the liberation and the conquest. History is not a weapon to prove we are right. History is a mirror that shows us how complicated human experience really is. And Kazan, on that October day in 1552, shows us that mirror more clearly than almost any other event I know.